C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity argues free will makes evil possible, the only thing that makes love, goodness, and joy worth having. If there won't be evil in heaven, how can we have free will to choose and thus make his love worth having?
Well, there's a very simple and straightforward response to this that I've given many times. I'm not sure that we both agree on this, so I'd be interested to hear your input. But I think the free will defense in that way, in other words, free will is the only thing that makes love possible, is not a good defense. And for the reason that the questioner is raising. If God does not have the freedom to sin, and that's the question here, freedom to sin. Now, we're not talking about the broader issue of determinism. We are just simply asking about whether one has the freedom to sin. And the argument that is offered is that unless you have the freedom to sin, then love is not meaningful. Then you're just a chatty Cathy, so to speak. This is an old toy people used to use, a doll that you pull a string and it says, I love you, and it's just mechanical. And, of course, the problem there is obvious. Not only will we not be able to love in heaven because, at least arguably, we will not have the freedom to sin because we will be morally perfect. God never loves because he does not have the freedom to sin. His moral perfections disallow that so-called freedom. It's actually not a real freedom. It's not like a lack of ability. It is a capability. It is the ability to live morally perfect in virtue of his character. So I think this is not a good argument. I think that there is a free will argument that can be offered, but not that one. And I've never, actually in the past, many, many years ago, I did advance that one until I thought about it. And incidentally, and this is something that I've never actually heard anybody else say, but I've mentioned a number of times since it's dawned on me, we don't love as acts of freedom anyway. Okay? Think about it. I ask people when we discuss this, do you love your children? Of course I do. And when did you start loving them? Right when they were born. Oh, really? Did you say, oh, that one's my kid. I am choosing to love them as an act of my free will. No, love happens in you. All right? And when people get married, love happens to them too, which is why, at least in the West, we choose to marry who we do because love is happening. That's why people use the phrase fall in love. Okay, it's something that happens to them. It is not something they're choosing to do. Now, there is a sense that's entirely legitimate in which you choose to be loving in certain relationships when you don't feel love, marriage, children, etc. But that really isn't the heart and core of love. And many will say, well, that's a different kind of thing going on where you're choosing to act loving as opposed to feeling the love. The feeling of the love is not something you choose. It is something that happens in virtually every single case, and it is our universal experience. Being able to love in a deep and rich way is not related to freedom of choice at all, and it never has been. By the way, this opens up then some possibilities with regards to the way God works sovereignly in the distribution of grace and the whole issue of God's sovereign grace and its relationship to our choice, okay, of Him. I think it's entirely legitimate to argue that God works on us in such a way that He creates love in us for Himself. And a desire for himself, just like our exposure to some person in our life generates in us a love and desire for them that we then act on by getting married to that person or if it's just a friend, hanging out with more often. Okay, if love happens by some external thing, then that external thing could easily be God working with regards to our relationship with him. And it's interesting that Jesus uses language similar to this in John 6 when he says, no one can come to me except that the Father draws him. And then the picture there is a fish net in which someone is captured and drawn in. And so it's a picture of sovereign grace, God doing the acting. But the way he acts in our lives is such that we then desire him. It's not a violation of our freedom any more than falling in love is a violation of our freedom. And what's interesting, too, about this notion of falling in love, just to add a sharper point to it, when people get involved in illicit relationships, sometimes their weak defense, I think, morally weak defense, is, I didn't choose this. I didn't plan to do this. It happened. You know, the famous Judy Garland song, "You made me love you, I didn't want to do it." Well, it's capturing something true about the condition. Now, of course, it's not a legitimate reason to pursue that, but notice that even people involved in illicit relationships are acknowledging that sometimes they aren't choosing the emotion. These things happen to them. Unfortunately, immorally, they give in to those things. But notice the genesis. The genesis is outside, not inside. And so these are the reasons why I don't think this way of arguing regarding the fall is a good way to argue. And I'm not sure how much Lewis develops this idea, but the core of it is that if we don't have the freedom to choose to love, then love is not legitimate. And that, I think, is a false statement. So insofar as that concept is informing, to some degree, a person's explanation of why there's evil in the world, I don't think it's a good one. I do not develop that argument in the story of reality. I develop a little different kind of argument. But it's not the argument that free will is what makes love possible. Because, and free will in this regard being freedom to do otherwise, libertarian free will, freedom not to love, okay? Because otherwise there would be no love in heaven and there would be no love in God's character.
I think this is the exact right question to ask, because if you are using as the defense for God for the existence of evil, if you're saying that the purpose of Well, let me back up. I'm losing my train of thought here. If you are using the idea of free will to explain evil, because otherwise there would not be real love, I think this person is exactly right. There's no way to explain how things are happening in heaven. It doesn't make sense. And I think that alone
How there can be a love in heaven.
Right. I would say, Greg, you pointed out that the idea of libertarian free will is what he's talking about here. There are different ways to understand what meaningful choices or how meaningful choices are possible. And this question kind of assumes that libertarian free will is the only way that's possible. And I disagree with that. And I know you do when it comes to
Can you
salvation
explain the
issues.
concept for our listeners, Amy?
Libertarian
free will is?
So libertarian free will is the idea that that you can choose to do otherwise, I think, is probably the basic way of saying it. I'm not a philosopher, so I might not be getting this exactly technically.
No, that's right.
Accurate, but yeah.
That's the CDO. That's the, pardon me for walking on you there. That's the CDO condition of libertarian. Could have done otherwise. So if we have libertarian free will, we can love or we cannot love. If God has libertarian free will, then God can choose to love or not to love. That certainly is in his capability. So,
and in this case, too,
that's the definition of libertarian.
If the idea is that evil is possible with free will, then, as you pointed out, Greg, this would say the same would be true for God. But we know that our choices come out of our nature. And this is why God's choices are always, always perfectly good. And yet he still has free will. It's because it's coming out of our nature, and our love comes out of our nature. So when God corrects our nature at the end of time, he's correcting our fallenness, and that means we will love correctly, which means we will love God correctly. And so that will come out of our nature. We won't sin because our nature will be corrected and we won't be fallen anymore. But again, I think this defeats the idea that the possibility of doing evil is necessary for true love to happen.